Welcome to another episode of the Impossible Life Podcast. I'm your co-host, Nick Surface, and of course, I'm joined by my podcast co-host and friend who does not get an intro, former Navy SEAL Garrett Unkelbach. And the reason he does not get a special intro today, which is like the first time in a couple hundred episodes I haven't done that, is because we're joined by a very special guest, Chris Widener. Chris, welcome to the Impossible Life.
Thanks for having me. I got to tell you, Garrett doesn't need an intro. All you need to do is say, a few couple words, which you did, and that's enough to listen to him. Former Navy SEAL. Oh, okay. That's all we need to know.
Well, thanks, Chris. So excited to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sure. Now, for those of you out there going like, okay, I'm looking forward to hearing from Chris, let me tell you, if you're looking forward to hearing from him, you're right. And if you're not, let me tell you why you should. So Chris Widener has been named one of the top 50 speakers in the world. And I could just stop there, but I'm going to keep going. He's a member of the Motivational Speakers Hall of Fame. He's been named by Success Magazine as one of the top 10 sales speakers in the world and by Inc. Magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers in the world. Global Gurus named Chris one of the top 20 sales speakers in the world in 2025, which is this year. We're recording this in June of 2025 for those of you listening later. He's given 2,500 speeches all over the world and has written 25 books, which have been translated into 14 languages. He worked with and was personally mentored by speaking legends John Maxwell, Zig Ziglar, and a guy you may have heard of named Jim Rohn. As a former pastor in the Christian Missionary Alliance, Chris recently started his own 501c3, Chris Widener Ministries, to promote the work of revival and spiritual formation in America. His latest book is The Coming American Revival, endorsed by President Trump, Senator Tim Scott, country star John Rich, actor Kirk Cameron, and more. The book can be found at comingamericanrevival.com. We will link to it in the show notes so you can go get yourself a copy. Chris, there's a lot in that bio. And it's very impressive. So I have so many different places I want to go, but I so appreciate you taking time to come on. We're honored to have you here with us and be able to share you with our listeners.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I love doing these and, just challenging people to grow in the Lord and get to know them closer and then to see the abundant life that comes from that. It's only in following the Lord that we find purpose and meaning. I mean, that's the whole premise of the book of Ecclesiastes, which is one of my favorite books. And guys, if you haven't read it, those of you listening, read the 12 chapters where the richest guy in the world of all time, if you translated his dollar today, it'd be $2 trillion. Like he could buy and sell Elon Musk a few times. And the whole story is him trying to find things that would bring him purpose: women, books, gardens, laughing, all these different kinds of things that he tried. And at the end, he said, that's where you hear that term, meaningless, all is meaningless. After everything he tries, he says, meaningless, all is meaningless. He ends the whole book in chapter 12 by saying, and this is the conclusion I've come to for a meaningful life: love God and obey his commandments. Yeah. All the other stuff isn't going to fulfill you.
We love, we share a verse on this podcast a lot from Ecclesiastes, which is Ecclesiastes 3:11, where he says, God placed eternity in the human heart. Solomon discovered that doesn't matter who you are, there's something within all of us that's searching for more.
There was a book written back when I was in Bible college called Eternity in Their Hearts. And it was a missionary who showed up in these foreign countries. And he was much further in the work of missions because he found out that these people were expecting him. Eternity was in their hearts. He walked into one village and he didn't know if he was going to die or what. They threw him a parade. And when he finally learned the language, not a parade, obviously, but they were carrying him around on their shoulders, and it was a black tribe. And at the end, when he finally learned their language, he said, "Why did you receive me so well?" And they said, "For thousands of years, we knew that one day a man with white skin would come in and tell us how to find God." It was in their hearts. Wow. It was in their oral history. It was in their tradition. So God does do that, puts eternity in men's hearts.
Yeah, I think that's such a good reminder for all of us, because Ecclesiastes is a dangerous book. Because if you only read the first 11 chapters, you're like, man, I'm depressed, right? Like, I can't believe the Bible put this in there. Like, what were they thinking whenever the council might say got it wrong? The book. Yeah, you have to get to that last verse you quoted, because otherwise it's a story loop that's not closed. And you're like, man, nothing I do matters. But man, what a great reminder that like God's always preparing the way, and he's always prepping the soil, whether we know it or not.
There's also a really interesting thing, and I was doing my research on some other stuff, and it's so apropos to the book of Ecclesiastes and man's search for meaning. Do you know that the number one demographic for people who commit suicide in America is affluent white men, and the demographic with the least amount of suicide is poor women of color? Now you might go, well, wait a minute. poor women of color, they don't have much hope, to get rich and successful. Why don't they kill themselves? But then all these people that have all the stuff. Well, here's what's happened. We've been told as we've grown up in America, go to college, get a good job, get a good wife, make a lot of money, have some, 3 or 4 kids, put a picket fence around your house, then buy the vacation home, then get a boat for the vacation home, and you'll be happy. And then what happens is they do it and they go, I'm not happy. And they have no other alternative. They don't know the gospel. They don't know God. So they off themselves. Poor women of color tend not to be given that dream. Most of them, a lot of them, single moms. And so what they do is they place their hope in God and in their relationships. They have this network of relationships with the other poor women of color. It's a fascinating study to find out that it's the unfulfilled hope that is what makes affluent white men kill themselves. And of course, we know the only hope is Jesus. And that's why they're left hopeless.
It's one of the greatest promises of Scripture. You know it, Chris. Nick and I know it. A lot of the listeners of this podcast know it. Scripture doesn't promise us that we'll have a happy life. Scripture doesn't promise us that we won't face any trouble. And indeed, Jesus guarantees like you will face struggles. But truly the promise of following God, and I think this is so great, is that you'll never know emptiness. Yeah. That's the one thing too. The world tries to sell you happiness. It never doesn't. It doesn't try to sell you fulfillment because it knows it doesn't have it.
Yeah, you can find a Christian who's tight with the Lord, who's dying of 4th-stage cancer, who's happier than a billionaire who has nothing wrong with him. Yeah, it's where you place your hope.
Yeah, man, I love that. That was a nice little. If that's the way we started, man. I mean, geez, this can only keep going.
We're only in first gear, guys.
Okay, hey, Chris, guess what? We're right there with you. We're still stretching.
Let's take this to the course.
Been started. All right. So I want to get a little bit of background on you. And then, like I said, there's so much in your bio that I want to dive into. So I'm going to try and draw, Garrett and I are going to try and draw every single, all the juice out of you that we can to just share with the audience and be a blessing. But let's go back to your roots. Like, what was it like for you growing up and how did you find yourself in the motivational speaking world? Because
horrible upbringing. In 1969, when I was 3, my dad made $90,000. He was the 5th partner at an architecture firm called NBBJ. At the time, they had about 150 architects. Now they're one of the world's largest. They did the Google campus.
Wow.
And in 1970, when I was 4 years old, he died of cancer. And he only had $30,000 worth of life insurance. So that began a downward spiral, 28 homes, 11 different schools, shipped off to live with relatives twice, once in the 4th grade, once in the 6th grade, 9th grade, started drugs in the 6th grade. Made most of my money growing up betting the horses at Long Acres Horse Track in Seattle, which isn't even there anymore. Now it's Emerald Downs. But I think the one thing that really saved me was at the age of 11, I got a job as a ball boy for the Seattle SuperSonics. So I spent 7 years through all junior high and high school, 6th grade through senior year as a ball boy for the Sonics. Won an NBA championship in 1979 with them. I was in a ticker tape parade through downtown Seattle and, the whole deal. And then the summer before my senior year of high school, I was spending the night with my biggest pot smoking buddy. And it was a Saturday night. At Sunday morning at about 8 a.m., his mother threw the door open and said, "Get up, we're going to Sunday school." Now, I had no church involvement at all, no church involvement, no church knowledge. I had literally no clue what Sunday school meant. Ends up, I go to this little Lutheran church, Mount Si Lutheran Church at the corner of 8th and Ogle in North Bend, Washington, up in the Cascade Mountains. It was now it's kind of an affluent town, but back then it was a logging town. In fact, it's where they filmed the show Twin Peaks. And frankly, living there was weirder than Twin Peaks. But so anyway, this youth minister there had 2 things I needed. Number one, size 11 cowboy boots. I'd never had a guy put his foot in my rump and tell me, get your life together. And then the second thing that he had was he told me that God had a purpose for my life. So I got saved, went to Bible college, got a youth ministry degree, and then was a youth minister for 3 years in northern New Jersey. And then I was a church planter in Seattle. And I really got into speaking then because my denomination didn't have any money to help me build these churches. I started 3 churches in the greater Seattle area from 91 to 2002. And so I started telling my story about growing up. And so I started out with high school, summer camps, colleges, kids. That eventually transitioned over into more adult speaking, time management, leadership. And then in 2002, God called me to go and write and speak full time. And from 2002 to 2007, for the first all 7 years, I worked with Jim Rohn and wrote for him, wrote his last book called 12 Pillars. And then 2 of those years I ghost wrote for John Maxwell, and 2 of those years I co-hosted Zig Ziglar's television show, which is still on YouTube. It's called True Performance. If you search for it, people say, how long ago was that? And I say, about 30 pounds ago.
That's incredible. I honestly, I couldn't find anything on your early days when I was researching you, Chris. I did not expect, I thought you were going to have some sort of foundational figure like a parent that led you to the faith. I love that it was a strong man.
When I went to Bible college, my mother said to me, you are so talented and so smart. Why are you going to waste it going to become a pastor? That's literally what my mother said to me when I went to Bible college.
Did she change your tune?
Well, she changed my tune when I started writing and speaking full time and bought a big mansion. Then she kind of felt like, oh, okay, now he's got his act together. But even as a speaker, working with Jim and John and Zig, they were all Christians in the secular market. So I really learned how from them to take the gospel into a business setting. And one of the things that I found fascinating was when people did hear my story. I remember the first time it happened, I was speaking to Microsoft down in Cave Creek, Arizona. And the person who hired me says, now you're going to tell your story of growing up, right? And I go, well, I can if you want me to, but I don't know how it relates to selling software. No, because it tells people if you can do it, they can do it. So I had this little thing that I did, particularly with smaller groups where I knew there was going to be a Q&A. When I got to that 17-year-old thing, I didn't tell the story about going to church. I just said, and when I was 17 years old, I had a very transformational moment in my life. I stopped going that way. I started going that way, completely revolutionized my life. And then when it came time for Q&A, one of the Christians will have figured it out. Yeah. And they'll raise their hand. They go, what happened to you when you were 17? They just threw me a softball, and I'd take 2 minutes, tell my conversion story. And I remember after that very first one, I asked the gal at Microsoft, I said, are you cool with that? She goes, no, it's totally fine. They asked the question. You told the story. You didn't belabor it. Nope, totally fair game. So I started using that trick when I was doing smaller corporate gigs, because I always knew that one of the people would figure it out and ask me the question and set me up.
Yeah, I love that, man, to be strategic. Thinking about that guy's cowboy boots up your backside, you'd appreciate Garrett every Saturday morning. Like we said, we both help lead a group of over 400 men at Mighty Men at our church in Frisco, Texas. And Garrett is very good at reminding men why we do what we do. I have to give him so much credit because he's experienced standards like most people don't know exist. And he has put that into what we do. So there's very clear standards. We start every Saturday the exact same way. And so he gets up and tells them and reminds them that there's breath in their lungs. So God has a purpose for our life. And we have a shout that we do together, which is Rock Kazak, which means be strong and courageous. Cause it's reminding them that fear is going to rob you of your destiny, but God's called you to be strong and courageous. And then we do push-ups. And it's that sort of like, hey, it's push-ups not because we want to show how buff we are, but push-ups because it's like, this is a reminder that you have to pay your price and put your flesh on the altar and lead yourself. Cause at 7:15 or whatever time it is that we're doing command push-ups, because Garrett doesn't make it easy on us. We do like command style push-ups. It's nobody's going, what I feel like doing is cranking out an unknown number. Cause sometimes Garrett feels, a little bit wild and he's going to go high. And other times he's going to go not as high. That's about the easiest it gets, but it's such a good reminder of like, you got to pay your price always.
And I tell you, you guys are doing God's work, doing men's ministry, because when I was a young pastor at 25, somebody gave me the best advice ever in building a church. He said, if you get the kids, you get the kids. If you get the moms, you get the moms and the kids. If you get the dads, you get the dads, the moms, and the kids. So go after men. And when I preached my last sermon before I transitioned into speaking, I don't remember what sermon I gave, don't remember the topic, don't remember the scripture I used. I remember one thing, looking out at that audience and seeing all those men who at one point told me they would never come to church. And there is a war on men. And I think it's easily understandable why there's a war on men, because we're called to be leaders. And, If you strike the shepherd, the sheep will scatter. Men's ministry is at the root of everything I believe in, that I work for, and guys like you who are out there on the front lines doing that. 400 guys a week. I mean, that's got to be near the top in terms of weekly men's meetings in the country. That's amazing.
Chris, I want to go back to something you said a minute ago. I love the topic of doing ministry in a business setting. It's one of the things I'm most passionate about, and Nick the same. And, talking about the right way to do that, because there absolutely is a right way. And I think a great way to do it. I think it's kind of reminds me of some of the stuff that we did in the military, which the best operations are sneaky operations. In a business setting, it is a little bit of a sneaky operation. because I think people, when they know they're going to church, what are men going to do who don't have a relationship with God? They put up all of their walls. They have all of these barriers. One of the privileges God's given me of being a Navy SEAL is people listen to me. And there's a lot of credibility in the community that I came from. And so when I talk in a business setting, people really want to hear what I have to say on leadership and teamwork. But then when I throw little things in and I plant little seeds, they don't realize that I just planted a seed of a relationship with God right next to a seed of leadership principles. And that's exactly what you're talking about doing, right? It's putting the truth right next to the lessons.
Well, and I would say if somebody really wants to very quickly and easily start beginning to sow seeds in a business setting, if you say, well, Jesus said this, then they're going to there might be a little bit of pushback. But one thing that never gets pushback is Proverbs. Yeah. And I always call Proverbs the Bible's little success book. Memorize as many Proverbs across a wide variety of business topics like time management, money management, relationships, all those things. And you can drop in little Proverbs and nobody has a problem with it, but you're dropping in little seeds of scripture. And Jim Rohn used to do that all the time. Jim and Zig were a little bit different. Zig would just say, Jesus said, but Jim would say things like, ancient wisdom tells us, and then he'd just quote the Bible, or he'd say the old proverb says, and then he would just tell the proverb. So there's different ways of going about doing it. It depends on your personality and your communication style. But I think people can really just say, God, help me to minister to anybody who I talk to today. And and just be able to do that. For example, when I'm doing secular speeches, the third point of my speech, Art of Influence, is about serving. And so one of the things I always quote Philippians 2 verbatim. I just don't tell them it's Philippians 2. Consider others' interests more important than your own. And then I quote Zig, you can have anything you want in life if you help enough other people get what they want out of life. But here's my goal when I go in and give a speech. I get down on my knees right before I go out and speak, and I pray that my words would be God's words. And I have a prayer request. And the prayer request is that when I'm done, somebody in the audience will come up and ask me if I'm a Christian. That way I know I've gotten right to the line without, overstepping my boundaries and the boundaries that the person who hired me gave me. And so it always happens like this. Somebody comes up to me and they go, can I ask you a question? And I always know what the question is going to be, because otherwise they just ask the question. Right. And then they go, are you a Christian? And I go, I am. And you're an answer to prayer. And they go, how am I an answer to prayer? And I said, right before I spoke, I asked that somebody would come up and ask if I'm a Christian, because that tells me that I was in the sweet spot today. And it's a confirmation of me being, weaving enough scriptural principles in without being super overt about it, so that the Christians get it and they know they get it. And then the non-Christians are getting those seeds of scripture placed into them.
Yeah. So good, Chris. The one other little tactic that I like to use besides Proverbs is, let me tell you a story.
Yeah.
And I don't need to tell you it's from Genesis. Just let me tell you a really good story.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so good. So I got to ask then, Chris, how did you get introduced to Jim Rohn and Zig Ziglar, and then eventually, John Maxwell? These are not small names.
Well, so I knew John legends. When he was still a pastor, and all the pastors knew him and nobody else knew him. And he was big in the pastor world. He used to have a thing called the Enjoy Life Club, INJOY Life Club, and it was cassettes that came out once a month. And I took a graduate level course from him when I was a pastor and he was still a pastor. And when I resigned being a pastor, the very first thing I did, in fact, I was just with John about 6 months ago. There was about 50 of us together. Maxwell flew a bunch of us down there. And I said, have I ever told you how I paid your speaking fee back in 2002? And he goes, no. And I said, I had a $375,000 house and I took a $100,000 mortgage out on it and I gave you 55 of it. And he goes, you took a mortgage out on your house to pay my speaking fee? And I go, yep. And so I put on a conference about 3 months after I resigned. I had him and Jim Whitaker, the first American up Mount Everest, and Vince Lombardi Jr. And so it was the four of us. We did a leadership seminar up in Bellevue. So that's how I kind of got to know him. And then the president of his company asked me if I would ghostwrite for him. I knew the president of Jim Rohn International. He knew I was ghostwriting for John, and he asked me if I'd ghostwrite for Jim. I said, well, I'm not going to ghostwrite, but I'll co-write. I'll write it all, but I want my name on the cover. And he said, done deal. So I worked with him for about 7 years, writing and emceeing their events and speaking at their events and stuff like that. The way I met Zig was in 2004, I had a friend of mine, and he was selling he was selling photography software through Costco and Sam's Club, and language learning stuff through Costco and Sam's Club. And we came up with this idea to create personal development audios. So the box had 14 CDs and 1 DVD in it. And so we licensed like 1,000, speeches and audio programs from other speakers, put them into a box. Zig was in almost every single box. And the more famous they were, the more they got paid. I think Zig got 25 cents a box. And so I started writing him big checks once a quarter because we were selling 50 to 75,000 boxes a month through Costco and Sam's Club. 3 biggest were leadership, sales success, and verbal power, it was called.
It's a lot of quarters.
So that's how I got to know them. So I started doing a TV show down in Dallas. I had an office up in South Lake with Jim. Jim's office was in South Lake. And so I was already at the network, and they offered Zig a job. And I didn't know it at the time. But Tom asked me if I would be his co-host, and I didn't know it at the time, but it was the onset of his dementia. The very last conversation I ever had with Zig, he and I were in a room together, and our managers were talking about something in another room, and it was about 20 minutes, and he told me the same story 5 times. And so Zig had perfect long-term recall. He could tell you a story down to the minute details from 70 years ago, but then he would forget he just told you the story and he'd tell you again. So I was really brought in to sort of pace the show and move the show forward. And just, I basically said I threw batting practice for Zig Ziglar. Here you go. Here's the next one. Whack, But it was a great lesson working with those 3 guys. I've been thinking about writing a book called The Power of Playing Second Fiddle, because the biggest boost in my career was when I played second fiddle to those 3 guys. And I always say it's better to be second chair at the Boston Symphony than it is to be first chair in the Omaha Boys Club Symphony, right?
Yeah.
And so putting yourself around those other people is really what's going to catapult your career.
The quote on second fiddle, maybe you do. Nick's heard me use this before about, is one of the things that I feel like is a lifeism for me is, people will say to me like, man, thank you for this or thank you for that. And I say, look, I'm honored to play my part, because I understand that I'm not the guy. I work for the guy. And, but Leonard Bernstein, who was a great composer, was asked, what's the hardest instrument to play? And he said, second fiddle.
Yeah.
He said second violin. Yeah. He said, I can get so many people to apply for first violin, but it is incredibly hard to find the right person to play second violin.
Yep. There's an ego thing involved. In fact, I tell speakers, they say, how'd you get to work with those 3 guys? And I said, I asked the right question. And it's a question nobody else asks these guys. When somebody meets a guy like Zig Ziglar, they say, I want to be just like you. Will you help me? Wrong question. Zig doesn't have time to help a lot of people. The right question, and I asked each one of these this question, I want to be just like you. How can I help you? Well, they have lots of ways that they need help. They don't have the time to help you, but they have the time for you to help, or the need for you to help them. For John, it was ghostwriting. For Zig, it was co-hosting his TV show. For Jim, it was ghostwriting and co-writing and hosting seminars.
Right. And the Jim, did I miss the Jim Rohn introduction? Did you cover that?
Yeah. Well, I guess I didn't tell you how I got introduced. They called me up and they said, hey, we see what you're doing with John. Would you come and do that with us? And I just said, as long as I get my name on it.
Okay. Yeah. You did. Yeah. I always find that so interesting about how God works in patterns. Right. And like you see, okay, well, I was doing this with John to be a blessing. Well, now it's Jim. And then it's, and you see that in the life of Joseph, how he just gradually kind of kept leveling up by being faithful with what he had. I love that. So I've never personally spoken to someone. This is a little bit of a personal satisfaction question, so bear with me, please, Chris. I've never spoken to someone who knew Jim Rohn and Zig Ziglar. Like, Seasons of Life is one of my favorite books of all time. I recommend it to everybody. I've read it. It's the only book I've ever just read indefinitely. Like, every time I finish, I'm like, well, I'm gonna go right back to it. It's amazing. So I have so much respect for Jim Rohn, and obviously, and Tony Robbins had a big impact in my life at a period whenever I needed somebody that was not necessarily preaching the gospel, but that could still help you. So I say all that to say, like, I know you wrote 7 Years with Jim Rohn, which I actually just bought before we had you on here. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. But like, what were they like to be around, man? Because like, I don't know that many people will have had personal experience, and I'm just like, what was the biggest lessons they taught you, and like, just things that
the biggest lesson I learned in working with those 2 guys was to be myself. Now you might say, well, that's kind of a weird thing to learn from, but here's the deal: you could not find 2 people who were more different.
Right.
was this extroverted, when he walked the stage, he pranced, he talked, he'd pump his fist, he'd yell, he'd come to the front of the stage, get down on one knee, and he'd whisper to you like this, very demonstrative, and Jim Rohn was an introvert, and Jim would, he'd sit behind the lectern like this, a wise man once said, and he would just talk like this, never move from being, and we always used to joke that we always knew he was getting amped up when he made his power move, and his power move was this. Whoa, Jim took his readers off. Look out. He's getting wild. And so, but yet, even though they were so different, they were both at the highest levels of that business, of fame, of money, of influence. And so what I realized was I don't need to be a knockoff of Zig, and I don't need to be a knockoff of Jim, because they're not even a knockoff of each other. They're as completely different as you could possibly get. I need to be the best Chris Widener. Take my skill set. When my career really took off around that time, I had a good friend from high school who came and heard me speak. And he came up to me after, he said, what would make you so much better as a speaker? And I went, what? And he goes, if you were as funny on stage as you are off stage. And I realized that I had this sort of, well, I'm a speaker, I need to be prim and proper and sound intellectual and, all this stuff. When I started doing voices and acting out and doing goofy stuff, that's when my career just went, people started ranking me higher in the speaking evaluations, all that kind of stuff. But it was for a kid from high school. And he was basically telling me, just be yourself, man. You're a funny dude. Get up there and be funny.
God bless you for saying that, Chris. I'm going to remind Garrett of that next time I'm doing funny stuff and he's just looking at me with that intense look.
Give Chris some quick background there.
So Garrett, look, Garrett's a Navy SEAL, and like one of the things he's told me that they talk about with the dev gurus, like Team 6 guys, is be everything they expect you to be. AK, when you think of a Navy SEAL, you don't think of a guy who's 30 pounds overweight, eating donuts and just like laughing about how easy his life is. You expect a guy who has like the intensity of a stare that could make somebody spontaneously combust and who's disciplined and well put together. And that's Garrett. Like Garrett, he's very conscious of how he comes across. I think he has a unique God-given authority in the way that his identity and the way he presents himself. And so he doesn't see a lot of use for humor. Whereas I am, and we've had these discussions at length, whereas I am wired way different. I've never even seen the grinder. I never served in the military. I'm a disciplined person because, discipline's required to grow and be all that God's made you to be. But I like to crack a lot of jokes. I do the voices. I'm in on all of that. And so,
all right, I'm going to make both of you better speakers right now, because I'm going to teach you a secret about speaking.
Please.
There's a lot of psychology of the listener. I started out writing speeches for a friend of mine who ran for governor, and we took all of his people through what we call an emotional roller coaster. Because if you're just like this and you're monotone, or you're only serious, or you're only funny, people don't learn, and their brain doesn't re-engage. So we literally wrote his stump speech so that they were laughing, then they were serious, then they were clapping, then they were, standing, then we took them through that. So we had like 5 different laugh points, 5 different serious points, 5 different meaningful points, and we just cycled people's brains through that. So here's the secret of humor. Even Garrett, if you don't want to, you're not a stand-up comedian, you don't have to be, but I'll tell you the power of humor, and I'll give you an example of how I use that in my main keynote. When you laugh, you open up both physically and psychologically. So when you laugh, what do? You go, ha, 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 that's funny. You like literally open up. You throw your hand. Physically, you open up, but your heart opens up, your mind opens up, because you're releasing all of the threat. People are now laughing. The power of getting people to laugh is inserting a serious point right after it. And I'll give you an example of how I do that in all my speeches. I tell the story when my daughter was 14. She got a job at a little local coffee shop in Seattle. Started out $25 a day in tips. 2-3 weeks in, she's getting $50 a day in tips. 6 weeks in, she's bringing home like literally $75 a day in tips. So I call her into my office and I go, hey, you're just selling coffee up there, right? And of course, everybody, just like you laugh, everybody laughs. Yeah. It's a funny line. And then she goes, oh yeah, Dad, I finally learned how people work. And I said, oh, took you to 14. All right. Most people get it earlier than that. But okay, Gandhi, what's the secret of life? And my daughter says, people love to talk about themselves. So she says, what I used to do was take their order, ignore them, make their coffee, hand them, they'd give me their money. some of it would go in the tip jar. Now, all I do the entire time I'm making their coffee is ask them questions about themselves and let them talk about themselves. Where do you work? You come in here every day. Where do you work? What do you do? Did you have to go to college for that? What does your wife do? Did you meet her in college? Blah, blah, blah. How was little Johnny's soccer game? How was little Susie's t-ball game? Whatever. She says, now they give me their money. I give them the change, and all the change goes in the tip jar.
Huh.
And then she says, and then I say, now in a way, it's kind of sick. I mean, here's a 14-year-old girl who just learned how to manipulate 45-year-old men for money.
Yeah.
And they laugh. Everybody laughs. And then the knife comes, the scalpel comes. But there's a deep spiritual truth to that. And the deep spiritual truth is that there are men and women walking all over who are so desperate for somebody to care for them that a 14-year-old girl who figured out how to ask them questions about themselves and give them a chance to express themselves tripled her tips because of it. So when you're engaging with people today, make sure that you're communicating with them, but not just communicating, connecting. People say we're the most connected generation in the history of the world. We are not the most connected generation. Yeah. We're the most communicative generation in the world, but we don't have much connection at all. So what I do is I get them to laugh, then I bring them back in, then I get them to laugh, and then I stick the knife right in them. But there's a deep spiritual truth to that story. And they hear it because they've just come out of this laughter kind of thing. So I don't know that I believe in just telling a jokes like, priest, a minister, and a rabbi walked into a bar. But if you find a funny story that can get people to open up, that's a perfect time to insert that really meaty thing.
No, so good, Chris. I'm a huge fan of tactical comedy. I always tell people that's why Nick's here. Sometimes he tells the jokes, and other times I just make fun of Nick.
Yeah.
Nick hears me speak all the time on Saturdays. And he's like, you were funny today. I was like, yeah, because I was too serious. If it were up to me, I would be serious all the time. The only reason I'm ever funny is because I want to be more effective than I want to be serious.
Well, I have a friend who's won 29 Emmys for comedy writing. Name a famous comedian, and not recently, but like the old timers, Seinfeld, all those guys. And he actually, we belonged to the same chapter of the National Speakers Association at one point, and he gave a thing on using humor, and he gave a thing called, I think it was called humor memory jogger or something like that. And it was just all these things that can make you think of a funny story. And one of the funniest ones to me was a time you had an injury.
Yeah, of course.
Like, you tell the story of how my big injury story, one of them was I hit a cow doing 45 miles an hour on my dirt bike in the middle of a dairy farm, flew over the handlebars, my helmet filled up with cow manure, snapped my right arm. Well, it's funny. It's a funny story. It wasn't funny at the time. Yeah. But there's all sorts of things you can look back in your life that are, in hindsight, kind of funny.
Yeah. I got to say, Chris, I'm always happy to paint Garrett with a different brush if it's amusing, but I have to give him his credit. Garrett's speaking at some pretty influential places now for big corporations. He was with Oracle. He's been at 7-Eleven. His wife is like my little sister, and we're wired very similarly. We love the jokes. She laughs at all my jokes, even more than my wife. I always tell people,
I married my wife because she smiles all the time and I don't. So
right.
Well, I was going to crack a joke. I was going to crack a joke earlier, but now I just have to say it. So I don't know much about Navy SEALs. I know a lot of Navy SEALs, by the way. But I know there's a few things you learn from the Navy SEALs from movies. One, Bud's Week, right? Everybody knows Bud's Week.
Hell Week.
Hell Week, yeah. Week, Buds, yeah. Number two, they're badasses. And number three, they're always at a family picnic with all the other guys when the beeper goes off and they all ditch their wives and go on a mission. Like, that's the only thing you know from the movies. Yeah. Like, are they not always at a backyard barbecue and everybody's beeper goes off and they all look at their wives and go, gotta go, honey. Out the door they go.
Yeah, that's 100% true. But that is how they're portrayed all the time. But what I was saying was like, the reason I say about his wife is because she's like my little sister. And I always say to her, I was like, it's a shocking thing for me when I go with Garrett and he speaks at these corporations, because it's like everything you just said, he employs. And I watch him like this charm offensive. I remember I had a mic on him one time and I was filming and I was remote. And I flipped on the camera so I could listen to his conversations. I was like, who is
he? He heard me before I went up on stage.
Yeah, he's up there schmoozing.
Back there on my camera.
Yeah.
But Nick, I mean, come on. Now, I know, Garrett, you're married now, but come on. The opening line, there is no cheesy pickup line with a Navy SEAL. It's simply, hi, I'm Garrett. I'm a Navy SEAL. Oh, okay. Buy me a drink.
No,
right? I mean, he's got a pretty...
I get that, but like it's like so funny because I see like intense Garrett. We spend a lot of time together doing all sorts of things. We've run 100 milers, we go hunting, we do all sorts of stuff together. And so to see that side of him, like where he's just, I'm like, who is this guy? And I find it very amusing as his friend to see him turn on.
I use it as Nick would confirm this. I use it as the setup. I'll lower, and it's a lot of the psychological training that I've had in the military. I'll lower your defenses, and then I'll just cold clock you with like the most important thing that you need to
Are
hear.
you an introvert, Garrett, by nature?
If you like, I've been scored in things like the Highland Ability Battery. I literally score right in the middle, 50-50.
Oh, really? Interesting.
He showed it to me. I was like, because I've heard other people say they're ambiverts. He's like, I actually am. Here's this hard data. I was like, all right, I believe you. It's wild.
I really, 50-50. I mean, through everything I've been through in my life, Chris, I really just have a heart at this point in my life of, God, who do you need me to be?
Yeah.
And Pastor Keith, who's an incredible leader, he said that leadership transcends personality. And I think that's so true. And when you've spent a lot of your life, following God, being submitted and leading yourself well, like there's things that you realize through when you work with people who are really great at personal assessments. I can show you how like I naturally am, but who I appear as is through maturity is very different than some of what my natural tendencies are.
Well, the nice thing about knowing what your personality is, you can hire to the difference, right?
Yeah.
So on the DISC profile, I don't know if they still use numbers, but they used to have 1 through 7. 1 was very low, 7 was the highest. And the first 2 are more extroverted. The last 2 are more introverted. And I literally scored a 77-11 on my deal. I was the highest D, highest I, lowest S, lowest C. And so when I was a pastor and hiring staff, I always hired people who were high on the S and the C. Because I'm not the guy you want to organize anything. I'm the guy who can pitch the vision, who can communicate it, who can get people on board. But man, I'm not the executor. You need somebody like that. So that's one of the nice things about knowing our strengths and weaknesses in regard to our personalities.
Yeah, it's I don't know what happened to Nick. We'll catch him back here in a second. He might have some internet trouble.
There he is.
But the best part is really knowing yourself.
Yeah. So I wanted to, I'm sorry, apologies there. I did have technical difficulties, which I feel like I never have technical difficulties until we have a guest on The Impossible Life on Riverside. So,
he's 2 for 2 recently, Chris.
Yeah. Recently, Chris. And like the last time my internet went out completely, that was just my camera decided to pop out. So apologies there. Wow. So I want to draw. I mean, you've got such a deep well of knowledge, and you've already dropped a bunch of things. I'm just so grateful to hear myself, let alone be able to share with our audience. But like you've taught influence and salesmanship to so many people. I mean, you have like the who's who, General Electric. You have massive companies. I mean, you mentioned Microsoft, and so you even wrote the book Art of Influence. So what do you think the biggest misconception people have about influence and selling is?
People don't understand that your character matters more than your skill set. And Zig used to do an audience participation thing that I sort of modified to teach people this lesson. And I've done this with over 1 million people around the globe. The largest group I ever did it with was 7,000 people in Garland at the Garland Event Center down there near you guys out in Garland, Texas. And I asked them to break up into groups of 2 or 3 and to create a list of 10 words. And each of those words is to represent a word that you think describes a great leader you have known or you know of. So it could be a coach, it could be a teacher, it could be your parents, it could be a famous business person. Write down those words. They write them down. Now I go back and I say, okay, I want you to write either a C next to it or an S next to it. A C is a character trait. Integrity has a C next to it. Education has an S next to it. Now, go through your 10, put a C or an S next to it, and then calculate a percentage. That's why I do 10. If you have 6 and 4, it's 60%. You have 8 and 2, it's 80%. They go through it, and I've done this, again, with 1 million people. I tell them at the end, everybody got your thing? Yes? Okay. Now, I'm going to ask a question. If this is you, I want you to raise your hand, hold it up, leave it up, and look around the room. If your group had more C's than S's, raise your hand. Look around the room. 90% of every audience always comes up with more S's than C's. In fact, 90% of the audience, 100% of all audiences have had an overwhelming response to character rather than skills.
Right.
And so what I do then is I say, okay, put your hands down. If it's true that what you guys are looking for in a great leader is more character than skill, then it begs the question, isn't that what people are looking for from you? If you're looking for it, and this entire audience is looking for it, and every audience before this is looking for it, that means people are looking for it. So when I hold the mirror up to you, I want you to think about, who am I as a person? Because what people think about you as a person, even at a subconscious level, that's what's going to make them determine whether or not you're going to influence them or not. And that's another misconception. You do not get to decide whether you have influence or not. Everybody else decides whether you have influence or not.
And that's why I think to turn that into like a leadership development and parenting development, that's why it's the most important thing to develop character in your children. Because I want skills that are developed by character, not character that's developed by skills.
Absolutely.
So what you got to focus on first is the character development portion. I am who I am today because I have two incredible parents who that's all they focused on with me. Not like, hey, let's build your skill set. They said, let's build your character set.
Well, and that's partly why I was joking earlier, that you didn't need an intro because you're Navy SEAL. But there's other groups like that. When I hear somebody's an Eagle Scout, I don't need to know much more. If you're an Eagle Scout, I know a lot about you already. And a lot of it is character. A lot of it is discipline. There's certain professions that you just go, oh, if that's what that guy does, he must be pretty good.
Yeah. Well, Chris, that's amazing. That's Proverbs 22:1, isn't it? It's a good reputation is worth more than silver or gold. It's such an underrated thing because you're always building your reputation in every single thing you do every day. It's ongoing. So I'm not going to run through every one of your books because there's a lot and I don't have 25 questions, but you wrote The Angel Inside, which, if I could summarize, it was about following your passions. And we talk about a lot about purpose on this podcast. It's one of the things that I feel like we're particularly deep in. And it's the hole that a lot of people are trying to figure out. They know they lack purpose, but they can't figure it out. And so much of that book was about following those passions. And I think Christians struggle to be unleashed because they're afraid of getting it wrong. You know what I mean? So how do you believe God uses passions to steer people regarding purpose?
Well, the Bible says, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. And God gives us these desires and ambitions and all these kinds of things, right? And so The Angel Inside was the first book I wrote after I stopped ghostwriting for John Maxwell. And it was number 2 on the Wall Street Journal, number 7 on the New York Times, number 3 on Amazon overall, not a category. And the book is a fictional story. Most of my books are fictional stories, and it's a 20,000 word story that takes place in one afternoon. And it's a young American, 28 years old. He's on the final day of his vacation where he went to Europe to find himself, didn't find himself. He's sitting on a park bench and a little old Italian man comes up to him, starts talking to him, and they spend the afternoon together and he teaches him life lessons from the life of Michelangelo. So Michelangelo, and this is where this all weaves together. Michelangelo was in early 1500s in Florence, Italy. Now, in the early 1500s was the onset of citizen legislatures. That's really where it was born, was in the early 1500s. And so being a politician was the highest regard. To be a politician would be the best thing you possibly do. And looking back now, it seems crazy, but being an artist, not really respected. So Michelangelo's dad did not want him to be an artist, to the point where Michelangelo left his home at 14 and went and lived with an art patron. Now, imagine this. If he would have gone and done what his dad wanted him to do, nobody would have ever heard of him. Yeah. But he went and did what God put in his heart and gifted him to do, and he became the greatest sculptor of all time and produced, arguably the greatest statue of all time. Although I think the David is only his second best statue. His best statue is one called the Pieta, which is in the Vatican, which is the dead, full-grown Christ laying across his mother's lap. And here's a funny story about that. He did it, and then he went back to Florence, and people started saying to him, "Hey, have you heard about this new statue that so-and-so did? It's in the Vatican," and da-da-da. And he went, "That's my statue." He went back to Florence. The only piece of artwork he ever signed was that one. And on the sash, it says Michelangelo, because he was so jealous that they thought that somebody else did it. But then I tie it into the real life David. They end up at the foot of the David there in the Academy di Galleria there in Florence, and they're looking at it. But think about the real life David. Jesse is, working his home, doing his thing. Samuel shows up and says, "The next king of Israel is here. Bring me your sons." He brings in all these guys. He goes, "It's not you, it's not you, it's not you, it's not you." And he looks at Jesse and goes, "Is this all your sons?" He goes, "Well, I got this scrawny little kid, He goes, "Bring him forward." The kid comes forward. It's David. Samuel anoints him. "You'll be the next king of Israel." And do you remember what he said to Jesse? Man looks on the outside. God looks on the inside. And one last little fact about the statue. The statue of the David had been commissioned to 2 or 3 other artists before Michelangelo. The first one
Yeah.
before Michelangelo was born, and the reason nobody ever did with it was because it was considered an imperfect cut of marble. It was very thin, and everybody was afraid to smash it because they thought the whole thing would fall apart. But Michelangelo saw what was in it. In fact, the title comes from a made-up story that's been around forever. A little boy came up to Michelangelo while he was making the David, and he says, "Sir, why are you hitting that rock?" And he says to the little boy, "There's an angel inside and I'm setting it free." Everybody else saw this frail, thin, piece of marble. Michelangelo saw the greatest statue ever made inside of it. And so I think that's the difference. We can't let other people, you're too tall, you're too fat, you're too young, you're too old, you're too black, you're too white, you're too this, you're too that. No, it's what's on the inside of us. The outside doesn't matter. And God is the one, this goes back to what you're talking about, Garrett, that character development. It's what's on the inside that matters.
Yeah, God looks at the heart. I love that. Now, Chris, you teach. Like I said, I'm just trying to draw. There's so many things that you've had. What, 4 careers now? In between writing, ghostwriting, being a pastor, being a motivational speaker, being a host. But like, do you still teach your Ancient Wisdom Business School that's on your website?
It's all automated now. I don't do the live version, but people can go to it and they can order it, and it just starts sending it to them.
Yeah, and we'll link to that. But I looked at your Ancient Wisdom Business School, and I have to say it warmed my heart, because the very first lesson you teach is fear of the Lord, which I absolutely love. That in business school, your first 101 lessons are all to do with wisdom and your relationship to God. You don't even get into anything about business until your 201s. But what do you believe God's heart to be towards business? Because you've worked in it a lot.
I think that there's so much about money in the Bible. In fact, I love recommending books. So I'm going to give you another book. It's called The Challenge of the Disciplined Life by Richard Foster. Now, you might go, well, that sounds kind of weird, but the original title was Money, Sex, and Power. And I don't know what brain surgeon of a marketing guy decided, we should take the greatest title of all time and change it to The Challenge of the Disciplined Life.
Yeah.
But it has a whole section on money and what God thinks about money. One of the things I like about Foster's book is he talks about the light side of money and the dark side of money, the light side of power and the dark side of power, the light side of sex and the dark side of sex. And so he basically says the Bible says that money can be good or money can be bad. One of the reasons why I think that God is so interested in business is because it's where most people spend their time. And it's in handling the one thing that God said is his biggest competitor. Why did God say you can't serve both God and money? Instead of you can't serve both God and cooking or God and golf, or, he said it because it's the number one thing that people crave outside of God. And so when we make our business holy, when we make our money holy, when we subject our business and our money to God, that's what makes it sanctified. And God wants us to have sanctified businesses. Wants us to use them not only for a way to generate income for ourselves and our families and the charities that we support, but also to help the other business people that we're doing business with, and to make a difference in the world. So I think God is very interested in business.
Yeah, I mean, he created us with work to do, right?
Yeah.
But I just think so many people struggle with that, because you'll find, there's people who, they struggle with not making money an idol, or having the spirit of mammon, or they believe they want God to be, that God wants them to be poor, or they couldn't possibly believe that God would want them to be wealthy. We get comments from people we don't know about oh, are you guys the prosperity gospel? And I'm like, I don't know what gospel you're reading, but if you read the Bible, God is favorably disposed towards his I'm not saying that everybody's designed to be a billionaire, but he's also, anyways, I could go on and on about that, but it's wild to me how people, that seems to be a nerve touching issue for people. So how do you train yourself and others, especially in business, to keep God first and honor him while also being successful? Is there, when you're walking someone through this, what's your approach?
I was asked this question about 3 months ago. I was on a Zoom with 30, 40 business guys, and the guy said, how can I, grow my business and make it everything that God wants it to be? And I said, well, simple question. Do you tithe? And he goes,
yes.
No. And I go, start with that. Until you do that, everything else isn't going to work, because tithing is such a brilliant thing. God designed tithing, not because he needed the money, but because he knew what tithing would do to us. Now, think about this. If you make $1,000 a month and you tithe $100, that's a lot of money. If you make $100,000 a month and you tithe $10,000 a month, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money to both people, which is why I love the percentage as opposed to just, tithe $500 a month. That wouldn't matter at all to the person who makes $100,000 a month. But writing a check for $10,000 every month, all of a sudden you start going, man, I could buy a nice car at the end of the year if I didn't give my money to God. But what it does is, and Foster talks about this in the book that used to be Money, Sex, and Power, now The Challenge to Disciplined Life. He said,
the book
money,
formerly known as
money is like a mistress, he says. It wants you to think about it. It wants you to love it. It wants you to hold it. It wants you to possess it. And by giving money away, you're saying, I don't need you. I don't want you. You're not my thing. And that's what tithing really does. It breaks kind of a spiritual stronghold there. When I was a pastor, I'm the only guy I've ever known to do this. I had a money back guarantee. And so here's what I did. I would say to people, listen, if you don't tithe, if you're at 2%, 8%, doesn't matter. If you don't tithe, here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. For the next 90 days, tithe. And at the end of 90 days, if you come back to me and say, didn't work, I can't pay my bills, I don't like it, whatever, I'll give you all of the money back that you gave during those 90 days. I did that for 11 years, never had a single person ask for their money back because they finally started working. It finally started working.
Yeah, amazing.
It's like Billy Graham would talk about the 3 salvations that people go through: the head, the heart, and the wallet. And
I never heard that. That's great.
It's not a direct quote, but he talked about the 3 salvations that people would go through, and that was something that they had to change. And the wallet is the hard one for so many people, because what you're talking about is submission. That's really, God doesn't care about what we do near as much as he cares about why we do it. You can build a great business for the wrong reasons. You can build a great business for the right reasons. But what he wants most, just like he proved with Abraham, is that we treasure him the most. And anything, and that's why they say God is a jealous God. There's much more to that, but it's what God wants most, is that we care for him the most. Like Jesus said to Peter, do you love me? And the test of that was, if you don't love me the most, you don't love me at all.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's a trust issue. I'm going to give away 10% of my money, and I'm going to trust that God's going to make that 90% go further than the 100%.
Yeah.
It's
honor.
The illogical paradox of following God. He asks us to do things that don't always make sense.
Yeah. So Chris, I got one more question, then I want to give you an opportunity to share anything you want just before we wrap. But like your current focus, right? We talked about your 501c3 Chris Widener Ministries to promote the work of revival and spiritual formation in America. How did you get focused there? And like, what do you think God's wanting for the modern day church?
Well, I was writing my 25th book. It was called The Capitalist, and it was a short little fiction story based about a billionaire who has to spend a family reunion with his niece, who is an Ivy League feminist studies major, and their conversations about capitalism. And I was about 40% of the way through the book, and I felt like the Lord tapped me on the shoulder and said, I want you to write a book on revival. And I was like, okay, time to dust the old pastor's hat off. And so I did a lot of research about revival, came up, there's been 5 great revivals in American history: First, Second, Third Great Awakening, Azusa Street, and then the Jesus People Revolution in revival in the late 60s, early 70s. And first thing I realized was that revivals come about every 50 to 75 years. Well, we are at 55 years now from the Jesus People revival. There also hadn't been a book that would have been widely read on revival since the 1950s. And it's a book I've read probably 10 times in my career, called Why Revival Tarries by Leonard Ravenhill. And of course, I'm very involved in politics, not so much anymore, but I was very involved in politics at the highest levels. And I kept hearing conservative Christians say, we need to get Trump elected so he can save America. And I would always say, Trump is never going to save America. The only thing that will save America is revival, because our problem is not a political problem. Our problem is a spiritual problem. Half the country lives out of a worldview that is a secular, humanist, God is dead, socialist, Marxist kind of worldview. And they're not people who follow the Lord. They don't want to know the Lord. They're atheists, whatever. Revival is the only answer to save America. And so what I did was I took a look at the spiritual state of America, and then I had chapters on what would revival look like in business, what would it look like in politics, what would it look like in education, what would it look like in the media, what would it look like in family. And I just went through, these are the premises of revival in each of these different categories, and scriptures attached to, how people should act and to bring about revival. And revival simply means, if you break it down into its roots, it means to come alive again. God always wants revival. God is ready for revival tomorrow. The reason we don't have revival is not God, it's us. When you look at the key verse that I use for the book, and everybody's heard it, 2 Chronicles 7:14, it's all conditional. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, heal their land, and forgive their sins. And some people may say, well, that's Old Testament. Okay, let's go to the New Testament, book of Revelation. He's talking to the 7 churches. And I have a chapter on the 7 churches at the end of the book, because they were all basically needing revival. He says to one of them, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Any man would open the door, then I will come in with him and eat with him and he with me. Jesus is standing out the door knocking, and he's not coming through the door like Garrett and his boys used to do with the big ramrod thing, right? He just stands at the door and knocks. If you want to have
preferably blow a hole in the side of the wall.
Okay, so the SWAT team's coming with the ramrod, but again, he's a gentleman, but he's always outside the door.
Yeah.
He's always, the Bible says, draw near to me and I will draw near to you. Everything is conditional, but it's only conditional because he's like, I'm already here. I'm just waiting. Call on my name. Let's go. And so the book is really a challenge to American Christians to look in the mirror and to say, I'm not living my life for the Lord. I'm not walking in repentance. I'm not walking in love. I'm not living in grace. And I need to get my act right with God. And when we all get our acts right with God, that's when you see revival.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I want to look at that book, Chris, because America is so primed for it. And it's like John Adams said, our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people. Yep. No person is the answer. Yep. If the people who operate this country do not serve God, this country will fall.
Absolutely, 100%.
100%. Man, Chris, it's been so good. I feel like we could probably spend a few more hours talking to you, but obviously we're not going to do that. But is there any last words? How can people find you? Is there anything, final words you want to share with the audience, general advice, anything like that?
Yep, I'll give people how they can find me, and then I'll give you because I get this question a lot at the end. It's like, what's one big piece of advice? And I got a great one for you. So, and I'll tell you a really weird story that goes with it. So
even better.
You can reach me at chriswidener.com, chriswidenercoaching.com. I'm now on TikTok. Woohoo! I've got like 150 followers. I'm on Twitter. Don't use it much. LinkedIn is really my thing now. I've got like 24,000 connections. So hit me up on LinkedIn if you want. I accept everybody. Here's the piece of advice that I've lived my entire life by. I was 22 years old. I was a youth minister, and I went to a seminar in Edmonton, Alberta. And during seminars, when you're at a seminar and you don't know anybody, you kind of just standing there with your coffee, like don't know anybody here. So anyway, I'm sitting there, and I go to turn to I don't know where I was going, restroom or back to the room or whatever. I turn around, I come face to face with these 2 women. One was about 55, the other was about 30. Bam, right there. And the younger woman goes like this, like she saw a ghost. And the older woman, who I found out later was her mother, the older woman looks at me, looks at her daughter, looks at me, looks at her daughter, looks at me, looks at her daughter, and says, "Is that him?" And she goes, and the mom goes, "Well, tell him." Or no, the mom actually says to me before that, she says, "In the middle of the night last night, this is my daughter. She woke up at 2 a.m, completely wide awake. She woke me up and she said, I just had the craziest dream. I saw a man's face in my dream, and I'm supposed to give him a message." And so she tells me that, and she looks at her daughter, who's still like this.
Yeah.
And she goes, "So tell him." And she goes, "I'm supposed to tell you to be a voice, not an echo." Never got their names. Don't know where they're from. All I know is they're a mother and daughter, and I spent 30 seconds with them. And I have thought about that nearly every day for the last 37 years. Be a voice, not an echo. And that's what we need. We need men of God who will be a voice, not an echo. Do your own Bible research. Do your own prayer. Yes. Listen to your own listen to the Holy Spirit to get your own message. Be a voice, not an echo. Anybody can read another guy's book and tell you what it said, right? Anybody can say, well, let me tell you about an experience with God somebody else had. Have your own experience with God.
Yes.
Be a voice, not an echo. Because if you think about, just practically speaking, a voice, you hear it, and you hear it first person, and it's loud and it's booming, you hear it. But what is an echo? Echo. It just gets quieter and quieter and quieter, and it has less and less impact as it reverberates, right? So that's always my best advice. Be a voice, not an echo.
Man, that's so good, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on with us, man. We're so honored that you took the time to spend with us, and it was man, it was even better than I hoped it would be having you on here. So thank you for just, you can add that to your bio if you want.
I will.
Nick Magazine, Nick Surface.
Nick Surface.
Totally agree, Chris.
Yeah.
I love hearing some of the, residue that's on you from Zig and Jim, but also love hearing some of your own voice in that message. So great to get to spend time with you and love what you shared with our audience. You don't know everything that we talk about here, but most of the people who listen to this show every week are just like, yes, we love this guy.
Yeah.
Well, make sure they go and get the book, Coming American Revival. They can get it at comingamericanrevival.com. And we need everybody, all hands on deck. It's one of the reasons I went back into ministry. God doesn't need one more motivational speaker. He doesn't need one more political pundit, but he needs everybody on hand to preach the gospel. He said the harvest is ripe and they're plentiful, but the workers are few. Pray that the Lord of harvest would rise up more workers.
Yeah. Well, we'll link to all those in the show notes, Chris. And I hope that we get to speak to you again in the future.
Anytime. Loved it. It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.